Folks, I'm going to be honest and frank with you. Our popular understandings of ideology and the political spectrum are fucking trash, dude. Holy shit. Alright, look at this. The left-right spectrum, trash. The two-axis model, trash. Horseshoe theory, trash. Whatever the fuck this is, garbage, trash, whack.
Me, I'm tight as fuck!
In this video, I'm going to carefully lay out why all these mainstream models of ideology, even our beloved fishhook theory, are deeply flawed models which struggle to properly account for all of the messy complexities of our real politics. After this pointed critique of mainstream models, I will go on to outline a much more useful and correct framework of political ideology and politics, built from a solid analysis of human society. As an aside, this video is not just merely a fun little intellectual exercise, a fun little debunking of pop science. The ways in which we conceptualize politics is deadly serious. How we understand politics absolutely dominates the ways in which we interpret unfolding events, the ways in which we interpret history, and dominates the ways in which we decide to organize. So, as a final note for this introduction, it's really important to make sure we're not using actual garbage to understand our politics. Right out of the gates, I want to put emphasis on the fact that I am not alone in my critique of popular political models. Mainstream political theorists, pundits, and mainstream political academics are all in agreement that these popular models are deeply inadequate and are unable to account for all of the complexities of real-world politics. But in response to their models' failure, mainstream political theorists and academics just continue on, constructing increasingly more complex and more convoluted models which, in accounting for one political complexity, loses comprehension of another. That's how we end up with nonsense like this. Where these mainstream political theorists fail is not so much because their models just don't have enough complexity yet, something that adding another axis or dimension might fix, but rather they fail right from the get-go in their approach to constructing these models. These approaches fail to produce an adequate model because these approaches start from abstract ideas in the abstract world, constructing their models in fanciful isolation, before trying to apply them to the material world. As these models are formulated in the clean and neat abstract world, it should come as no surprise that these models are wholly incapable of accounting for all of the messy complexities that come with the material world. To state that all a little bit more concisely, these approaches fail because they don't start from a materialist analysis of human society. They start from abstract ideas. To properly construct an actually useful and correct framework of political ideologies, you must root your framework in a solid materialist analysis of human society. If you step back and think about what it is I'm saying, it's incredibly basic. To construct a model of something, you need to know what the fuck it is you're talking about. You cannot construct an accurate model of a virus's mechanism of entry without a proper materialist analysis of the virus and cell. If you try to do so with abstract concepts like the concept of deception or sneakiness, you're going to fail miserably. Your model will be trash, and whatever conclusions you draw from your abstract model will be fucking trash too. Well, the key to any invasion, of course, is deception, so perhaps the virus sweet-talks the cell into letting it in, and bingo bango, you've got a successful virus entry. So if we want to prevent infection, all we need to do is educate these cells to spot deception through the use of reason and logic. Now, before I go on to conduct a materialist analysis of human society and construct a model of politics from this, I will first highlight some of the flaws of our most prominent political models to provide clear examples of the kind of utter trash which comes from constructing models in the abstract. by far the most widespread model of politics and political ideologies is the linear left-right model, whose origins can be traced back to revolutionary France, in which supporters of the old aristocratic order sat on the right side of the National Assembly and supporters of the new liberal order sat on the left side. This model is often used pretty casually in popular political discourse, and not much thought is given to what exactly it's measuring. However, when we ask this question, what exactly is this model supposedly measuring, we get a wide array of answers, all of which are vague and abstract, unable to account for the complexities of our politics, as we'll soon see. There are those who propose this model is measuring the size of government, with the left favoring bigger states and the right favoring smaller states. This is really cute in the abstract, but quickly falls apart when looking at reality to see rightists like conservatives consistently pursuing increases in things like military spending and expansions, and more left-leaning individuals advocating decreases in military spending. Perhaps, some argue, this model is instead actually measuring state intervention in the economy, with the left advocating more state intervention and the right advocating less state intervention. Again, a very cute model in the abstract world, but applying this model to reality, we see it utterly fail to comprehend something like anarchism, a far-left ideology which pursues the complete and immediate abolition of the state, leaving no room for any supposed state intervention. Not only this, but fascism, a far right-wing ideology, consistently employs state interventionist strategies to stabilize capitalist economies in crisis. There are those who propose this model measures change versus conservation, with the left advocating for more change and the right advocating for more conservation. Of course, this model, constructed in the neat abstract world, fails to see the real instances in which the left advocates for conservation, such as the conservation of Roe v. Wade, defense of labor rights or the environment, and where the right advocates for change in opposition. There are those who say maybe this left-right linear model is measuring something even more abstract, a much more grand idea, such as the notion of equality versus hierarchy. Although this model is incredibly flattering to those of us on the left, we should not let this flattery blind us. We find this model is unable to account for real political conflicts such as the gun debate. Guns themselves do not fall particularly neatly on this equality versus hierarchy scale. In the past, we've seen guns employed in the pursuit of liberation and in the pursuit of reaction, in the aims of equality and in the aims of hierarchy. Far-left ideologies such as communism and anarchism are incredibly pro-gun, but we also see moderate rightists within settler colonial states also quite pro-gun. Within American politics, it's only really the center-left which is quite anti-gun in all its forms. The basic idea here in this section is that regardless of the abstract notion you try and attach to this linear left-right model, this abstract framework fails to accurately model our real politics. As I've stated previously, in the face of their model's inadequacy, we see mainstream political theorists, instead of questioning their approach to the problem, merely adding another abstract axis in a sad attempt to compensate. So this section, dealing with the two-axis model, is just going to be a little bit longer than the previous section, as this is a model many political wonks and junkies still uphold, and I need to spend a little bit more time highlighting its specific flaws. Although keep in mind, I'm reiterating the same broad critique here. This model, just like the linear model, fails to properly understand our real politics because it has been constructed in the abstract with abstract ideas, as opposed to starting from a real analysis of human society. In an attempt to overcome the limitations of the linear left-right model, political theorists have added a vertical axis, an authoritarian-libertarian axis. The first and most glaring issue is that these concepts of authoritarian and libertarian are themselves incredibly vague and abstract, and I'll show you what I mean by this. The right libertarian views the ownership of another human being, when entered with consent from both parties, as a legitimate exercise of individual liberty and freedom to wield a complete and absolute power over another being, to come and fully dominate another's existence. Is this not the most authoritarian act of all, the practice of slavery? And yet this two-axis model pegs this as libertarian. On the flip side, the same could be said about the left libertarian, who seeks to abolish all instances of unjustified hierarchical dominations, which includes things like slavery. You dare deny me the personal right to own slaves? Are we not both consenting adults? How dare you deny us our liberty and our rights as free, independent individuals, capable of making our own decisions? How horribly authoritarian of you, you absolute tyrant! Of course, for leftists, that line of argument is a little bit silly. Definitely fuck you and whatever right to slaves you think you have, and if that makes me an authoritarian, then so be it. But the real point here is that there is a very clear disagreement about what libertarianism and authoritarianism even mean, and according to this model, which maps the vertical axis as independent of the horizontal axis, both left libertarians and right libertarians should be in agreement about what libertarianism is. But we don't see this. In fact, in real-world politics, it's the anarchists and communists who are most often in agreement, and we see very little, if any, agreement between right and left libertarians. Not only this, but this model fails to comprehend why there exists such an incredibly high level of cross-pollination between libertarian rightists and authoritarian rightists. But we don't see an equally high level of cross-pollination between left and right libertarians. This vagueness and abstract nature of the terms authoritarianism and libertarianism, as we've just highlighted, makes it incredibly difficult to figure out what this axis is even measuring in the first place. There's a claim that this vertical axis measures some social or cultural dimension, with more libertarian stances being for racial equality, gender equality, as well as things like marijuana legalization, and more authoritarian stances being in opposition to these social and cultural advancements. This, at first glance, certainly strikes as a legitimate distinguishing feature between right libertarians and right authoritarians, but this social/cultural dimension utterly fails to understand the left. We see both principled anarchists and principled communists in firm agreement about these social and cultural issues, with the real point of contention between the two groups being over the role of the state in transitioning towards communism. And so, there is the claim that this vertical axis of authoritarianism-libertarianism is a dimension which concerns the state, with more libertarian stances being anti-state and more authoritarian stances being pro-state. In the abstract, this is very cute, but if we look at the real practical implementation of something like a rightist libertarian vision, often referred to as anarcho-capitalism, where it is legitimate to privately own roads, to own a police force, to privately own an army, to privately own a bureaucratic apparatus to manage your sovereign land, and collect payments from your residents in exchange for protection or use of land, where it is legitimate to privately hold a monopoly on the use of violence, enforced by your private police and army. Is this not a state? Sure, it's private, but it doesn't make it any less of a state. Despite this reality, we see this proposed model place right libertarianism as anti-state, because this model is wholly unconcerned with the real material politics of our world. Let me go further in my critique by pointing out that if you ask any principled communist to take the political compass test and map them onto the two-axis model, each and every one of them will land in the left libertarian quadrant, because both anarchists and communists are working towards the same end goal and hold in their hearts the same exact end objectives. But this model is just incapable of comprehending something like a transitionary state. Not only this, but there is the nonsensical implication that there exists something even more left than anarchism or communism. And whatever that ideology or thing is, there exists something even more left-wing than that, and so on. I should theoretically be able to sit in a room and use my galaxy brain and be able to produce something even more left-wing. The same kind of infinite implication applies to the right, as well as to the scale of libertarianism-authoritarianism. This two-axis model absolutely fails to explain why we don't see these more left, more right, more authoritarian, and more libertarian ideologies or positions. Dude, I legit could go on for days about how absurd this model is and how absurd all other goddamn abstract models are, each more convoluted than the last. Again, the prime reason why all these popular frameworks of politics fail to properly model our politics is because these models are constructed first in the abstract world with abstract ideas before trying to apply them to the material world. And what you find is that each and every one of these models are unable to account for the real complexities that come with real politics. If we want to construct an accurate and useful model of human politics, we must first start from a materialist analysis of human society. Human beings, like all other living creatures, are material beings. Any proper analysis of human society must start from this fundamental recognition and take seriously its associated, inescapable consequences. We are not immortal gods who exist beyond the material world and can sustain ourselves through the sheer might of thought, rationality, and ideas. Humans are material beings who must satisfy their material needs. This is the inescapable requirement of existence. For human society to exist, they must drink, they must eat, they must clothe themselves, shelter themselves, and so on. When we ask how human societies go about securing this inescapable requirement of existence, in other words, when we ask how human societies go about producing and satisfying their material needs, we're asking a question about the mode of production. Whether it's hunting and gathering, slavery, feudalism, or capitalism, a society's mode of production births and shapes the ways in which humanity organizes society, births and shapes its prevailing ideas and concepts, its prevailing morals and philosophies, its prevailing social institutions, and so on. I'm actually touching up on a much larger subject, that of historical materialism, which will require its own dedicated video, but the main takeaway here is that our prevailing culture, morals, ideas, and yes, even political ideologies, don't just randomly fall out of the sky. These ideas don't just magically appear before us, nor are these ideas independently birthed by great minds, wholly disconnected from material existence. Our prevailing ideas come from our real material conditions. Our prevailing ideas and ideologies come from the ways in which we go about satisfying our inescapable requirements of existence. Okay, this is all a lot to take in, so let me make this concept a bit clearer with an example. Let's examine a society who goes about producing and satisfying their inescapable material needs via hunting and gathering. This society's mode of production is hunting and gathering. This mode of production is rather rudimentary and is unable to sustain any substantial surplus, only capable of producing the necessary products needed to secure this society's continued existence. It is a mode of production that requires every member to involve themselves directly in production. Otherwise, such a society fails to secure her existence. With such a society, the rise of more egalitarian attitudes, cultural practices, and ideas help to ensure the success of such a society. I, as a member of this hunter-gatherer society, stand to benefit in no way if another member is hurt and goes uncared for. I stand to benefit in no way if I withhold necessities like food from other members. In fact, my very existence is threatened when another member goes uncared for. As due to the demands of this society's mode of production, we need all hands on deck to secure our existence. It is in my interest to abide by these egalitarian practices, and I might even begin to articulate such egalitarian ideas as a comprehensive world outlook to advance and propagate these ideals in my society, as it is in my interest that all members abide by these egalitarian ideals as well. Here we've stumbled across the critical point of this video. As I've just said earlier, ideas come from our material conditions. But I want to make it explicitly clear why particular ideas arise from such material conditions. Why is it that we see this idea rise, but not this other idea over here? Particular ideas arise from a given material condition because such ideas advance the material interests of said condition. Let me make this point a bit clearer by going back to our hunter-gatherer society one more time. Let's imagine a 200 bajillion IQ, galaxy brain, god-tier genius is living in a hunter-gatherer society and is somehow capable of thinking beyond the limitations of his material existence, and he comes up with this wild new idea that he terms freedom. Freedom of the individual to keep the products they hunt or gather for themselves, and are, quote, free from the tyrannical pressures to share their products. In fact, our genius argues that this will force all the lazy members to work extra hard, and our society will thus thrive. This proposed idea, given this society's mode of production, is an idea dead upon arrival and has no chance of flourishing, as all hands on deck are needed to constantly muster together the bare minimum needed to secure this society's existence. Withholding necessities from other members means that, sure, today you may have an extra full belly and those so-called lazy members come to pass, but come tomorrow and you failed a hunt or failed to successfully gather enough, you've got no one else to turn to, and so too you come to pass. Instead, like I've described earlier, the ideas you see rise in these societies are those of an egalitarian character, not because these ideas are somehow morally superior to all other ideas or rationally superior to all other ideas, or because God cast down these ideas from the heavens. These ideas rise because they advance the material interests of a given material condition. Now, so far, we've just been examining societies with a hunter-gatherer mode of production. This is a mode of production in which all members of such a society share the same exact material interests. They all hope for successful hunts, successful gathers, they all hope no one gets hurt, yada yada yada, and egalitarian ideas help advance all their material interests. There is no adversarial economic group in this society which holds conflicting material interests. Hunter-gatherer societies are what's known as classless societies. For a much more in-depth explanation of class, which is absolutely critical to have for any leftists, I'd recommend you watch my video on class and class conflict. But the cliff notes for that video is that your class is determined by how you relate to the means of production. A given class holds the same exact material interests as one another. A different class, however, will hold different and conflicting material interests. If that's all unfamiliar to you, go watch the video on class. Now, in a classless society, such as a hunter-gatherer society, you do not see the same kind of ideological conflicts, the same conflict of ideas, as you see within societies whose mode of production does produce classes, such as our own. Within class societies such as our own, the ideological conflicts we witness are the reflections of a real conflict between oppositional material interests. Ideologies themselves are the articulated material interests of a given material condition. Here we have our model of political ideologies, our model of politics, not based on abstract ideas, not formulated in the abstract world, but rooted firmly in the material world. This is the materialist conception of human politics. Right, so, our ideologies don't fall out of the sky, our ideologies are not birthed by God, our ideologies are not birthed by great minds independent of material existence. Our ideologies are the articulated material interests of a given material condition. Within societies whose mode of production produces classes, which produces distinct material conditions, and thus conflicting material interests, We see this material conflict reflected in the conflict of ideas. Now, this model of human politics can be used to examine human politics in any era of human history. It is not temporally limited like other proposed mainstream political models. For now, we're going to use this model to examine our society, a capitalist society. The capitalist mode of production produces two distinct classes, the capitalist class and the working class. The capitalist class privately owns and controls the means of production, and their means of subsistence is getting others to labor on these productive means to produce goods and services to be sold. The working class does not own the means of production, and thus they must rent their labor power to the capitalist class in exchange for a wage. These two classes have distinct and conflicting material interests. The capitalist's material interest is to have the workers work as hard as possible and pay them as little as possible, just enough to sustain the worker and propagate their race. The worker's material interest is to be paid as much as possible for the labor they do. In more concise terms, the capitalists want to keep as much of the value generated by the workers as possible for themselves, whereas the workers want to keep as much of the value they have generated as possible. For the capitalist to keep more of the value, the worker must lose. For the worker to keep more of the value, the capitalist must lose. It is in the interest of the capitalist class to maintain this relation of exploitation in perpetuity, as this is their means of subsistence. It is in the interest of the working class to abolish this relation of exploitation, allowing them to keep and utilize all the surplus they generate. These are diametrically opposed material interests. There is no reconciling this conflict under the capitalist mode of production. The material interests of the capitalist class manifests itself as a capitalist ideology, which constitutes our society's hegemonic ideology, our society's dominant ideas, as we live under the dictatorship of the capitalist class. This capitalist ideology's chief and primary idea is the idea of private property as a legitimate right. The broad tradition of liberalism constitutes most capitalist ideologies. The material interests of the working class manifests itself as a socialist ideology whose chief and primary idea is the idea of public ownership, in which the economy is to be run by the people, for the people, and sees to it that private property is abolished. Pedantic side note, not every single class is going to produce a systematic world outlook which advances their material interests. It's only those classes whose members are in constant interaction with one another that we see said class begin to articulate their material interests in the form of an ideology. It's why, for example, workers in constant interaction with one another during production have articulated an ideology. It's why capitalists, in constant interaction with one another during trade, exchange, negotiation, investment, have articulated an ideology. And, for example, it's why we did not see a coherent peasant ideology articulated, who all largely worked in isolation from one another. This is not a super important point, but it's one for those more familiar with historical materialism. Now, the variations we see in capitalist ideology reflect the articulated particular and specific material interests of different strata of the capitalist class, the different material conditions that exist within the capitalist class. So a domestic capitalist and a finance capitalist agree upon the natural right of private property, but might have different material interests in regards to things like tariffs. Thus, we see different variants of capitalist ideology articulated to reflect the specific material interests of that condition. Just as variations in capitalist ideology reflect the variations in material conditions that can be found within the capitalist class, variations in socialist ideology reflect the variations in the material conditions that can be found within the working class. For example, both extremely well-paid workers in the first world and those workers most brutalized and hyper-exploited by capitalism and the capitalist state still hold the same common material interest in abolishing the capitalist relation of exploitation, abolishing private property, and establishing public ownership and control over the economy, as both are solidly working class. However, the well-paid first world worker does benefit materially from the hyper-exploitation of the global south, and those well-paid workers who reside within settler colonial states benefit materially from such continued colonization. These well-paid workers lead a comfortable life. Thus, we see this material condition give rise to a flavor of socialism, which is not particularly concerned with the immediate abolition of capitalism, a flavor of socialism whose position on imperialism is ambivalence or active encouragement, a flavor of socialism which sees to legitimize the continued occupation of a colonized people. Of course, I'm talking about ballot box socialism, sometimes referred to as democratic socialism, the idea being we should achieve socialism through bourgeois electoralism. I've detailed before how ballot box socialism is a doomed strategy, but those well-paid workers whose material interests are represented by ballot box socialism are not overly concerned with rigorously studying and elucidating successful strategies of liberation, but are more immediately concerned with remaining respectable and civil in the eyes of bourgeois society. A flavor of socialism which could not be bothered with decolonization, instead merely seeking to establish a socialist United States, a socialist Canada, or socialist Australia and perpetuate colonial rule. A flavor of socialism which remains complicit in imperialist wars or actively cheers on her nation's imperialist ambitions. Of course, ballot box socialism stands in sharp contrast to anarchism and communism, which are ideologies which do express the material interests of the more marginalized and exploited portions of the working class in comparison. Additionally, with this materialist model of human politics, we can now understand why the left-right spectrum, despite all of its serious shortcomings, has remained so prominent in political discourse. It is a model which broadly reflects the class struggle between a rising class and an established class, with left-wing politics broadly corresponding to the rising class's ideas and the right representing the ideas of an established class. During the French Revolution, the capitalist class and her liberal ideology represented the left, and the established aristocracy and their aristocratic ideology represented the right. In capitalist society today, in which the capitalist class's established rule, socialist ideology represents the left, and capitalist ideology represents the right. So left and right are still useful shorthands, but do not make the mistake of thinking of the left and right as representing abstract ideas. They merely reflect the material struggle between the classes. Before going any further, a point must be made. Just because an individual occupies a particular material condition does not mean this individual will necessarily adopt its corresponding ideology. This video is primarily concerned with providing a materialist model of ideologies and ideas, not with examining all of these specific factors which contribute to how an individual goes about adopting a specific ideology. This would require a much more robust discussion of cultural hegemony, the base and superstructure, the role of class intellectuals, manufacturing consent, and so on. However, an individual's given material condition, and thus its associated material interests, plays a significant role in the adoption of an ideology. Your material condition acts as a great pressure towards the adoption of ideas which advance your material interests. And in trying to get someone to adopt an ideology which does not advance their material interests, and often conflicts directly with the advancement of their interests, requires a near constant counterbalancing force which must struggle to overcome this pressure and obscure as much as possible the contradiction between the material interests advanced by this imposed ideology and the individual's real material interests. Right, think of trying to put together two magnets which repel each other. You can do it, but it requires the constant force from your hands, and the second you let go, the magnets are going to flip around and stick with their proper sides. This is an exercise both aristocrats of the past and capitalists of the present have engaged in, getting those you exploit to uphold their own exploitation. Let's take the average working class American. Although occupying a material condition whose material interests are best advanced by some flavor of socialism, the vast resources capitalist society invests into counterbalancing forces have produced a working class in which the majority have adopted some variant of capitalist ideology. Education, art, media, entertainment all repeat over and over the view of capitalism as the most rational economic system, which truly does advance the interests of all, and repeats over and over the same line that socialism does not and cannot work. Socialism means 100 billion people dead. Socialism means theft. Socialism equals bad. Socialism equals scary. Be very scared. Interestingly enough, you will find most socialist policies to poll extremely well among working class Americans, and you can even describe socialist aims and basic socialist critiques of capitalism to these American workers, and you'll find broad agreement. An agreement and support which comes from the pressure exerted by their material interests. But the second you mention the word socialism, these same Americans shut off and regurgitate these same myths about capitalism and the same scary stories about socialism they've had hammered over their heads their entire lives. Alright, we've laid out our materialist model of human politics and we've applied it to our capitalist society. Now it's time to highlight the usefulness of this model by examining particular political conflicts in our modern era. Let's start off with trying to understand the so-called culture war, which features prominently in most mainstream discussions of politics. Mainstream political theorists and mainstream political pundits, armed with their arcane political models, genuinely struggle to fully comprehend these clashes, like plague doctors deluded by their miasma models of disease. These pundits and theorists are doomed to fail in their efforts. Just like with every other political battle, this political conflict reflects a conflict of material interests. There are those whose material interests are advanced by one side of the conflict, and there are those whose material interests are advanced by the other side. If there was not this conflict of material interests, we would not see such a corresponding ideological battle. There exists a sizable faction of the capitalist class, most of whom hire domestically, whose material interests are advanced by socially reactionary attitudes, socially reactionary cultural practices, and socially reactionary policies. In other words, there are those who profit directly from racism, sexism, xenophobia, transphobia, etc., etc., etc. These are the capitalists who often go on to fund media outlets such as Fox News, which promote and aggravate socially reactionary attitudes within the working class, and go on to fund the campaigns of politicians advancing socially reactionary policies. These socially reactionary positions serve to divide the working class, creating and maintaining economically vulnerable and politically vulnerable pockets within the working class. These vulnerable populations within the working class are ideal for the capitalist class, as larger and larger shares of the value surplus generated by these populations can be extracted. In other words, these populations, made vulnerable, are ripe for hyperexploitation. This strategy of divide and conquer allows the capitalist class to reap a larger share of the value surplus generated. But the effect of creating and maintaining these vulnerable pockets through the promotion of socially reactionary attitudes and policies doesn't just stop with the hyperexploitation of these pockets. These hyperexploited pockets serve to create a general downward pressure on wages for the working class as a whole. As an undocumented immigrant, due to their politically vulnerable and economically vulnerable position, is forced to accept a lower wage. Other members within the working class are forced to accept a lower wage as well if they want to remain competitive in the labor market. Discrimination is good for business. Keep in mind, however, there are factions within the capitalist class whose material interests are not so tied up in the hyperexploitation of their domestic working class, such as finance capitalists. This faction's material interests are much more intimately tied to imperialism, the hyperexploitation of the global South's working class. Thus, these capitalists can afford to adopt much more socially progressive views and policies at home and court public opinion, but of course are fine with doing business with and allying with states who do uphold deeply reactionary social policies, attitudes, and practices. In fact, these capitalists are also quite quick to abandon support for socially progressive policies when these become inconvenient, which is why you find the American Democratic Party so wishy-washy on things like immigration. In the so-called culture war, the rightist position, the capitalist position, is the promotion and advancement of socially reactionary attitudes and policies. The leftist position, the working class position, is a position of absolute and unyielding solidarity across the working class, stripping the capitalist class of their ability to divide and conquer in their quest for a larger and larger share of the surplus value generated. Every committed communist and anarchist must promote this point of solidarity and ruthlessly combat any festering reactionary attitudes within the working class. In understanding the culture war, we have gained a critical insight into the gun debate. We see within the United States those capitalists who profit from the creation and maintenance of vulnerable populations through the promotion of socially reactionary attitudes and policies. Guns and gun ownership are desirable when employed as a tool of terror, furthering the vulnerable status of these populations. Indeed, American gun culture itself has its origin in the repression and terrorization of indigenous populations and slave populations. Understanding this, it should come as no surprise that when we see vulnerable communities take up arms in self-defense to fight back and make themselves strong, we see rightists without hesitation pass anti-gun legislation. Look no further than the Black Panther Party and the Melford Act passed by Republicans in the California State Assembly and signed by Darling of the Right Ronald Reagan, which outlawed the carrying of loaded weapons in public. Those who use abstract models literally cannot comprehend such a seemingly hypocritical act, but those who employ a materialist model of politics understand clearly. For financial capitalists, gun ownership is a glaring liability, a monstrously destabilizing force at home. Hence, we see such a hardline anti-gun stance from these factions. On the flip side, anarchists and communists see guns and gun ownership as absolutely critical in the pursuit of self-defense against state brutalization, a means of combating terror, and whose employment is critical in any armed struggle against the capitalist state. Not only does this materialist model provide us with a clear and accurate understanding of the political conflicts unfolding around us, but this model can provide us with tangible insights into effective organizational strategies. For instance, on the topic of persuasion, this model points towards effective methods of persuasion. For liberals, those employing abstract models of politics, persuasion is all about making the most rational argument or the most morally sound argument. That the art of persuasion is all about defeating your opponent's ideas and presenting your more rational or moral idea as the most logical idea. Persuasion is all about fighting in the realm of the abstract. In practice, this abstract method of persuasion proves laughably ineffective. Our materialist model of politics highlights the fact that it is incredibly difficult to convince someone of an idea which directly contradicts with their material interests. The vast amount of required societal resources dedicated to continuously drowning the working class and capitalist ideology speaks to this great level of difficulty. What this practically means is that you really shouldn't waste your scarce time and energy trying to persuade capitalists of the rational superiority or moral superiority of socialism. Instead, you should be focusing your persuasion efforts on those whose real material interests are advanced by socialism. Not only this, but your method of persuasion should be a direct appeal to these material interests. Your line of argument should highlight clearly this conflict of material interests between the capitalist and the worker. You must make explicit the contradiction between their material interests and capitalism, the contradiction between their material interests and the material interests advanced by capitalist ideology. In presenting socialism, you must start from their real material concerns and interests and highlight clearly socialism as an ideology which advances these material interests. And honestly, the best way to do this is to just listen to what your friends, family, and coworkers complain about work, and continuously highlight how these complaints are not only valid, but how they always tie back to the class struggle. It's a remarkably effective method of radicalization. Remember, kids, a good socialist is a good listener. Alright, we've covered a lot in this video, so let's just quickly highlight the important takeaways. Our mainstream political models are fucking trash. They fail to properly understand the complex realities of our politics, as they fail to start from a materialist understanding of human society. Human societies are marked by their mode of production. Modes of production which breed different relations to the means of production produce classes with distinct material interests. These material interests and their conflict are reflected in our ideological and political conflicts. Ideologies themselves are the articulated material interests of a given material condition. Capitalist ideologies at their core are marked by their belief in the right to private property and reflect the material interests of the capitalist class, with variations in capitalist ideologies reflecting the different material conditions within the capitalist class. Socialist ideologies at their core are marked by their belief in public ownership and reflect the material interests of the working class, with variations in socialist ideologies reflecting the different material conditions within the working class. Left and right are useful shorthands insofar as they are used to describe this class conflict and the reflected ideological conflict between socialist ideology and capitalist ideology. To examine a particular political conflict means looking past the bombastic political rhetoric and grand assertions and seriously examining the material interests reflected in the conflict, whose material interests are advanced by said idea, by said policy, by said argument, and so on. If you spot a fellow leftist unironically using one of these abstract political models, like the two-axis model, send them this video. If we want to be effective organizers on the left, we need to let go of our abstract and idealist approaches to politics once and for all, and adopt a serious materialist model of human politics. Hey, Lamo! This one was a long one. I worked pretty much the whole summer on this while I wasn't at work, so it was just a whole summer of lots of work. Most of the work was wrapped up in research, as I had to get a serious grip around historical materialism. Again, guys, holy crap, we hit 1,000 subscribers, so thank you all. That is bananas bonkers, and I appreciate the hell out of each and every one of you. We're well on our way now to 2,000, and if you yourself aren't already subscribed, you can definitely help us on our way to 2,000. Also, guys, there's been an explosion in new patrons. Big shout out to Another Slice, Chris Lehman, Dan Hernbrot, Max, My Fake Name, Ronan Hogan, and Taylor Bennett for all the support. Holy crap, and of course a big shout out to the OGs, Becquerel and Leonard Bulk. If you want to join all these lovely people, please feel free to support me on Patreon at Halim El Raw. I could use the support. But seriously, thank you to my patrons, holy crap. Also, you can follow me on Twitter at Halim El Raw. It's where I spend most of my time, and it's the easiest way to reach out to me. Guaranteed I'll respond eventually. Also, again, don't forget to hit subscribe for more leftist content.